now it's time to introduce the first of our two keynote speakers. I'd like to introduce Sunera Thobani to the stage. She's an associate professor in the Department of Asian Studies and the Institute for Gender, Race, and Sexuality and Social Justice at UBC. And her full bio, she's very accomplished, is in the bio, but I think we'll turn this over to her to share some of her words. Please welcome Dr. Sunera Thobani.
So I would like to begin by thanking all the organizers. I'd like to begin first by thanking Mary Nagani for inviting me to this forum. I'm very honored and thankful to be here. I would like to thank the organizations, NCIP and North Shore Multicultural Society, to all the partners and sponsors of this event, and also to all the volunteers. Thank you very much. I would also like to begin by acknowledging that we are on Indigenous land, that we live on stolen lands. This acknowledgement is expressed as support for Indigenous struggles for sovereignty. If anybody knows the effects of racism, violence, and occupation, of the relation between racial hatred, genocide, and the exploitation of material resources, it is the Indigenous peoples of Canada, the US, and Indigenous peoples the world over. They have been living with and resisting such violence for a very long time, and it behooves us all who are non-Indigenous to these lands to support the struggles of Indigenous peoples. The present struggles against racism and Islamophobia, which is the form of racism that I'm going to be talking about this evening, as other struggles for justice, need to be linked with the struggles of Indigenous peoples if any of these struggles are to counter the ongoing colonial practices on this land, and if any of these other struggles are going to bring about justice on this land. Given the range of presentations that we have here tonight, I will make some very brief comments based on my own research, my community engagement, and also my own personal experience, and I hope to follow up with a more expanded discussion when we have the open discussion after all of the presenters have given their talks. So my first point will be that how we define racism, how we define Islamophobia is very important, not the least for understanding how we go about challenging this highly destructive discourses. My second point will be that addressing the role of the media in the dissemination of Islamophobic discourses, racial discourses, has assumed great urgency in this particular political moment. We need to understand how the media representations we are surrounded with every day are connected to larger political practices, to forms of governance, and how they fuel and feed the racism that many peoples of color, Indigenous peoples, have to live with the consequences of. And my third point will be that there is a critical necessity to learn from, engage with, and build alliances with Muslim communities, with other communities of color that are the primary targets of racism, racial violence, and racial discrimination. So to expand on my first point, which is looking at anti-Muslim racism, which is also sometimes called Islamophobia, this generally tends to be discussed in the language of prejudice, in the language of fear, in the language of insecurity. It is often presented as provoked by ignorance about Islam and Muslim cultures and by a general mistrust of Muslims that is supposed to be well-founded after 9/11. Such ignorance and mistrust and fear, we are led to believe, generates some prejudice and maybe even discrimination, and in the more extreme cases of white supremacists, it can even provoke violence against Muslim communities. This violence, I must underscore, is very real. So, for example, a recent Statistics Canada report found that in 2015, hate crimes against Muslims have increased by 60% in Canada, and that the majority of these hate crimes are directed towards Muslim women. So there is a merging here of racism, gender, and I would also go on to argue sexuality, sexual orientation as well. While extreme forms of violence, such as hate crimes, are rightfully condemned as violations of Canadian law and even Canadian and by extension liberal values and tolerance, multiculturalism and democratic freedoms, the everyday forms of racism that are connected to these extremist versions are overlooked, and they continue to be either justified or normalized. So I think it is very important that we pay attention to the connections in which extremist racial violence and racial hatred exists, and the everyday levels of it that we continue to live with, continue to be perpetuated around, and our children grow up with. So, for example, how do we account for the surveillance and racial profiling of Muslims, which enjoys considerable political and public support, and yet see that as disconnected to the hate crimes and the extremist violence? So the argument I'm making in this point is that racism, racial violence, racial hatred is actually embedded in the institutional structures that shape our society, that shape the social world. Islamophobia, therefore, is a much more widespread phenomenon with very deep historical roots and very extensive cultural reach, which cannot be captured under the rubric of hate crime or extremist racial violence. Certainly after a decade and a half of the global war, the experiences of Muslim communities demonstrates that anti-Muslim racism and Islamophobia are now widespread in Canadian political culture and society, as in the US and the other Western societies where we're seeing the rise of right-wing extremist movements. We have to be able, in our daily understanding and confrontation of this form of violence, to recognize that it is a global phenomenon, that what happens in Canada is tied to what is happening in other parts of the world, and to learn to recognize how our social, political, cultural institutions keep reproducing these forms of racism and Islamophobia. My second point will be that we need to understand the role of the media, which I would argue, and which my research demonstrates, plays a leading role in normalizing racial stereotypes, racial prejudices, racial attitudes, in normalizing Islamophobic constructs of Muslims, who they are, what they do. The constructs of Muslims that have become pervasive in Canada today help legitimize the forms of extremist violence and targeting of these communities. So after 9/11, many of us might remember that images of Muslim women in burqas became widespread in the media. Even now, these images continue to be treated as transparent and self-evident proof of the misogyny, the homophobia of Muslims and Islam. Those of us who try and engage the complex histories of such representations, we should remember the French used them in Algeria, the British used them in India and the Middle East. Those of us who try and track the historical lineage of these representations and discourses, or who try and draw attention to the complex ways in which Muslim women express their agency and express their relationship to Islam are given no space in the mainstream media. We are treated either as dupes or apologists for fundamentalists. There is just no complex discussion of Islam or the practices of Muslim communities that is allowed in the mainstream media here in Canada. If we look at which voices are allowed space in the mainstream media, these are the voices that uphold the nationalist discourse of Canadians as inherently compassionate and generous, and Muslims as grateful to be accepted into Canada. These voices, I argue in my own work, reproduce older colonial and racial ideologies of Muslims needing to be civilized, modernized. The language of cultural barbarism is utilized by these voices as some Muslims separate themselves away from Muslim communities by pronouncing themselves more civilized, more modern, and hence deserving of acceptance into Canadian society. These voices project onto other Muslims, Muslim communities, by all of the Islamophobic constructs that we are familiar with. All of these are projected onto Muslim communities as backwards, and this becomes the condition for the acceptance of some Muslims who will speak the Canadian nationalist discourse for acceptance into Canadianness. My final point this evening is that in combating anti-Muslim racism and in combating Islamophobia, we need to build alliances and solidarities with the Muslim communities that are the target of this violence. Islamophobia has been quite effective in isolating these communities, in setting them apart in social and cultural as well as political terms. Unfortunately, this often includes being set apart even by and within social justice movements and by social justice activists. Anti-terrorism measures target not only Muslims in this country, but also those who would work with Muslim communities in solidarity, who now fear being seen as aiding and abetting Muslim communities and their organizations. With the definition of terrorism being so nebulous as it is, with its association with the figure of the Muslim, male or female, and also with the nebulous meaning of the terms aiding and abetting terrorism, there is now a chill on non-Muslims who might have otherwise supported and built alliances with Muslim communities. It is imperative that we contest this isolation. And organizations like the ones that have organized this event today are making some very important moves. In doing this, we need much, much more of this. In closing, I would like to just point out that we need to understand that racism works through dividing and conquering communities. Race is foundational to Canada as a settler colonial society. And when we talk about anti-racism, we have to go to the deep roots of processes of racialization that construct communities not only as different from each other, but as inherently and essentially incommensurable. We know that Black communities have been targeted with racial profiling in Canada as in the US for a very long time. We know that Muslims today, those who look like Muslims, are constructed in the national imaginary as a potential enemy. Those who look like Muslims, when we look at who's actually attacked and classified as such, are Black and brown bodies. And the racial profiling of Muslims today is connected to the historical profiling of Indigenous peoples, of Black peoples, of other peoples of color in Canada. And if we are to transform this society to end the fear and insecurity and anxiety that Maruna talked to us about, we have to go to the very deep roots of racial violence, racial designations, and processes of racialization in Canada. Thank you very much.